Lashana Tova. Tikkun Olam is a term that has become so popular, it's found its way into some parts of the general American culture. The Hebrew words Tikkun Olam are understood to mean repairing the world, and can be thought of as referring to such disparate activities as working in a soup kitchen for the homeless, recycling waste products to protect the environment, or helping to resettle refugees in your community, or any of a number of other social action or social justice projects. For many Jews, Tikkun Olam is a defining aspect of how they experience Judaism. But 3 years ago, on the High Holy Days, a colleague of mine, a rabbi at a conservative synagogue in the Detroit area, who I won't mention his name, gave a sermon entitled, "Time to Say Kaddish for Tikkun Olam." And he basically suggested that we need to bury the concept to save Judaism. Last year, a book was published with the title, "To Heal the World: How the Jewish Left Corrupts Judaism and Endangers Israel," written by Jonathan Newman. The book attempts to discredit the Tikkun Olam movement among liberal Jews. And there have been many other articles written recently that criticize Jews who participate in activities that they describe as Tikkun Olam. But after you get past the headlines, it turns out that their real complaints fall into one of four categories. Either they argue that the term Tikkun Olam historically was never meant to be used the way people use it today. It's kind of like that scene in The Princess Bride, which I hope many of you have seen, where Wally Shawn keeps describing events that are actually happening in the movie as inconceivable, until finally Mandy Patinkin responds to Wally Shawn saying, "You keep on using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means." So too, Tikkun Olam historically was not synonymous with social justice activities. It is a misuse of the term historically. It doesn't mean what you think it means. A second argument raised by Tikkun Olam critics really seems to misunderstand Jewish tradition altogether. They seem to be suggesting that Judaism disapproves of taking care of the poor, the stranger, or the planet, or that these activities at least are not a central aspect of what it means to be Jewish. A third argument against Tikkun Olam objects to some of what these critics perceive as the excesses of Tikkun Olam activities, particularly when a particular leftist progressive agenda is antithetical to Jewish survival. And finally, some of these critics are not really saying that we should stop doing activities that are labeled Tikkun Olam. They just want Jews to recognize that Tikkun Olam is not the sum total of what it means to be Jewish. So let's consider each of these four objections and see if we can find some common ground that we can all agree on. First, what is Tikkun Olam? What does it mean? Where did the expression come from? Can the term legitimately be used to describe social action or social justice activities? Tikkun Olam is a phrase that's not found anywhere in the Bible. Its first appearance is in rabbinic literature as Mipnei Tikkun HaOlam. And there it appears as a concept of repairing certain injustices in Jewish law. Many examples deal with divorce law to help protect women. But Hillel's famous Prusbul, which many of you may have heard of, encourages people to make loans before the 7th year when the loans will be nullified. That also was called a tikkun. But these are very narrow uses of the term Mipnei Tikkun HaOlam, and they certainly are not anything like what's used today. In the Aleinu prayer, which originated for Rosh Hashanah, we find the expression Litaken Olam B'Malchut Shaddai. But here, the Hebrew litaken has a very different meaning. It doesn't mean to repair the world, it means to establish the world under God's universal sovereignty. And if you read the entire paragraph in context on its face, the expression deals with a theological belief in the Messianic era, when God's sovereignty would be established in an ideal world. Now, that's not necessarily a social action agenda. And then finally is the Kabbalistic use of the term Tikkun Olam. In Lurianic Kabbalah, I don't know if you've studied Lurianic Kabbalah, I've done about this much, so I'm about this much knowledgeable. God's holy vessels shattered at the moment of creation, and the sparks of the divine became encrusted with rinds that trap them inside, and any Jew who performs a mitzvah, whether it's a ritual mitzvah or an ethical commandment, releases these sparks, repairing the universe from its cataclysmic injury. If that's a little obscure, you can ask Rabbi Horowitz afterwards what it really means. He's a much better expert than I am. It's true that none of these historic uses of the term meant a social action agenda. It wasn't until the second half of the 20th century that this modern use of the phrase Tikkun Olam became popular. So, point one for the critics. It doesn't mean what it used to mean. But, as any linguist would tell you, any language, any word in any language, can, and often does, change in meaning over time. We Jews ourselves have repurposed and given new meaning to terms and ideas over the centuries in lots of situations. The very concept of Messiah, for instance, originally just meant a king, somebody who was anointed with oil. The first time he's installed into office, he becomes a Mashiach, a Messiah. When we got our first king, King Saul was anointed, and so were all the kings after him. The idea of a coming Messiah who would usher in a state of world peace and prosperity didn't happen until Second Temple times. Was it illegitimate to change the meaning of Messiah in that way? I hope not. So who cares if modern Jews want to describe their social action work as Tikkun Olam? The question really should be, is it reasonable? Is it a reasonable use of the term? So as I said, the Aleinu prayer, L'taken Olam Malchut Shaddai, is clearly referring to the establishment of God's universal sovereignty in a messianic world. And in that time, as understood by our tradition, there's no question that social welfare will be universally improved. All people will be treated with dignity and respect. There'll be universal peace and prosperity, and the environment will be safe, clean, and protected, as in the Garden of Eden. So establishing the Messianic era is, by definition almost, the creation of a world of social justice. True, the tradition assumed that this would have to happen with divine intervention, but it's also true that in every instance of salvation in the Bible, from the Exodus from Egypt to the return from exile, God used human agents to accomplish the event. So why is it illegitimate for modern Jews to see themselves as God's agents in perfecting the world and helping to bring about that Messianic era? There are also numerous Jewish sources that can be brought to demonstrate a belief that human beings are God's partners in improving in God's creation in general. There's a famous story in the Talmud about Rabbi Akiva. A Roman general supposedly asks him, "So you believe in a God who created the world. So tell me, do you think that things created by your God are better than things created by humans, or the other way around?" And Rabbi Akiva surprised him and said, "Things created by human beings are better." The Roman general was astounded. How could you say human beings can create things better than God? So Rabbi Akiva told him a story. There once was a king who had two sons, and he gave him flax, and he gave him wheat. And he said, "Take these gifts, my children." And a week later, he came back to them, and he said, "Show me the gifts that I gave you." Well, one of the sons had taken the wheat, grinded the grain, kneaded the dough, baked it, and turned it into a loaf of bread. He took the flax, he wove it, and he made it into a nice challah cover, and he brought that to his father. The other son gave him back the wheat and the flax the way he gave it to him. Which do you suppose the king delighted in more? Obviously, the one who improved upon what he was given. So too, Rabbi Akiva said, human beings are supposed to take the gifts that God gave us and turn them into something better. An Orthodox rabbi, Norman Lamb, wrote about this in his book, Faith and Doubt. From the moment Adam and Eve were created in the garden, he said, they were commissioned to subdue the world and rule over it. Here's what he wrote. Man was commissioned to improve the world, to build it up, to transform it, to subdue it. And if he does so, he's paid for his labors. He gets a reward. But man never has title over his own creations. He has no mastery over the world. Despite his investment of labor and talent, the world, even as perfected by him, belongs to the original owner, God. Man must never entertain the notion that because he labored over his creation, he has the right to destroy them. Man, according to Norman Lamb, says, the teachings of halachic Judaism is responsible to God the Creator, for protecting and enhancing the civilization which he himself created. Subdue it is not only not an invitation to ecological irresponsibility, says Lamb, it's a charge to assume additional moral responsibility, not only for the natural world, but even for man-made culture and civilization. That's Norman Lamb, not a radical Reform Jew, but a mainstream Orthodox rabbi. So why not say that protecting the environment is an act of Tikkun Olam? It may not have been the original meaning of the phrase, but I think it's certainly a reasonable use of it. And I would argue that the contemporary use of the term Tikkun Olam is not a modern fabrication or a distortion of classic Jewish beliefs and values. Elliot Dorff points out in an article he wrote on this subject that the modern use to denote social action activities is recent and a new use of the term that perhaps began only 60 or 70 years ago. This does not mean that traditional Judaism did not value social action activities. It simply described them by using a different term, namely, gemilut chasadim, acts of loving kindness. Indeed, in the very first Mishnah in Ethics of the Fathers, the first substantive one, Shimon HaTzadik says that acts of loving kindness, along with the study of Torah and worship, are the three pillars on which the Jewish world stands. I could give dozens of examples of Jewish texts that support this basic principle. They all reflect moral quality. All of the summaries of Judaism by the rabbis reflect moral qualities and activities. In every instance, when a sage was asked to describe Judaism in a soundbite, it's ethical behavior, compassionate behavior that's emphasized, not rituals. Next week, on Yom Kippur, we read the prophet Isaiah in the Haftarah. And what does the prophet say? The people ask, "Why, when we fasted, did you not see? When we starved our bodies, you paid no heed." In other words, we did the ritual. Isn't that what you wanted from us, God? And the prophet answers, because on your fast day, you see to your business, and you oppress your laborers, because you fast in strife and contention, and you strike with the wicked fist. Is that the fast I desire, God says? A day for people to starve their bodies? Is it a bowing the head like a bulrush and lying in sackcloth and ashes? Do you call that a fast, a day when God is favorable? No. This is the fast I desire, to unlock the fetters of wickedness, to untie the cords of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, to share your bread with the hungry, and to take the wretched poor into your home. When you see the naked, to clothe him, and do not ignore your own flesh. It wasn't an accident the rabbis chose that prophetic passage on our holiest day of the year. The prophet Micah summarized what God expects from us in three things: to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with God. Shimon HaTzadik, as Elliot Dorff quoted, my personal favorite expression of Judaism, says there are three pillars: the study of Torah, worship of God, and acts of kindness. Without acts of kindness, what modern Jews call Tikkun Olam, you lack an essential pillar of what it means to be Jewish. So I would first argue that it's certainly okay to call social justice activities Tikkun Olam if that's what animates your doing them. Who cares if it's not the original meaning of the phrase? Words and phrases change their meanings all the time in any language, and Tikkun Olam, in my opinion, is a reasonable term to describe making the world a better place. And second, I would argue that if you're making the world a better place by performing acts of gemilut chasadim, acts of kindness for others, or acting to preserve the environment, then these are in fact essential acts that our tradition highly values. Indeed, our tradition suggests that these are precisely the things God created humanity to do, to take care of each other and to take care of the beautiful, awesome world he gave us. To somehow suggest that these activities are a distortion of Judaism, in my opinion, is itself a distortion of Judaism. That being said, my interpretation of Tikkun Olam here does not necessarily always suggest a specific policy agenda or course of action. Not everything that some consider part of their liberal, progressive, social action, social justice agenda necessarily fits with or is compatible with Jewish values. Here, there is certainly room for disagreement, debate, and discussion. While we can agree that we need to treat all human beings with respect and dignity, we can also agree that each nation should generally be allowed to determine its own immigration policy, how many people they want to have as immigrants, and what the criteria are for accepting them. And on these issues, we will no doubt have some disagreements, but that we need to treat everyone who comes to our shores with dignity and respect, even if we eventually decide we need to turn them away. About that, I think the Jewish tradition reminds us to love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. How we apply that principle, again, may leave us some room for argument and debate, but to ignore this message, repeated no less than 36 times in the Torah, is clearly ignoring something the Torah considered really important. Similarly, we can all agree we need to take care of the environment. First, we live here, and I hope we could all agree that it's important to not pollute it and make it uninhabitable. But from the Jewish perspective, as I mentioned, we also have the responsibility to tend the garden. How we go about protecting the environment and balancing our policies with other values, like making sure people have jobs and can earn a living, is a debate worth having. But let's be civil about it. No name-calling. Let's listen to each other's arguments and try to understand them before rushing to ridicule them. Let's try to avoid simplistic labeling. There's no substitute for thoughtful, critical analysis and questioning. That is also a Jewish value. And if we're debating among Jews, let's try to ground our decisions in the sources of our tradition. So how we apply Tikkun Olam in specific issues is certainly a subject we can and should discuss and debate. Finally, there's the argument against Tikkun Olam Judaism that so many Jews seem to think that Judaism is all about Tikkun Olam and nothing else. And of course, that's not true. The prophet Micah said 3 things: do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. Surely Judaism teaches us to believe in a created world and a creator, and that we do acts of Tikkun Olam, if that's what you want to call them, precisely because we recognize that life is a gift of our Creator, and we must not take that gift for granted. That doing acts of kindness are motivated, at least in part, because we see the spark of God's holiness in every human being. Similarly, Shimon HaTzadik had 3 pillars of Jewish life: the study of Torah, the worship of God, and acts of kindness. We must do all 3 to be good Jews. And of course, our tradition is replete with ritual commandments, which are rarely cited as the essence of Judaism, but they're certainly a significant part of what it means to be living a full Jewish life. I would argue that there's a utilitarian need for these rituals. They remind us of our past in order to focus our efforts and activities in our mission in life. We put mezuzahs on the doorposts of our house to remind us of God's presence in the world. We wear a talit and tefillin to remind us of God's commandments. The Jewish holidays emphasize different values of the Jewish tradition. Regular prayer, as we're doing today, the prayer book is full of reminders of what we believe and what we stand for. All of these remind us of our values on a daily, weekly, monthly, and annual basis, thus strengthening our resolve and purpose to be agents for God in promoting a better world. They also strengthen the bonds of our community so that we can do acts of gemilut chasadim as a community like we're doing with this family from Afghanistan, which multiplies the force of our work and offers an example to other communities to do the same, to be, as we like to say, a light to the nations. Those who criticize Tikkun Olam Judaism as abandoning Jewish identity raise a valid critique that we must pay attention to. Judaism is not just about being good and doing good deeds. Anybody can do that. Goodness knows you don't have to be Jewish to be a good person. But if our actions are informed by the study of our sacred texts and by a sense of holiness in our performance of acts of kindness inspired by the Creator, then we stand on all three pillars of Shimon HaTzadik's dictum, and we live a rich and meaningful Jewish life in the context of a strong and vibrant Jewish community. The bottom line is, let's not get caught up in words or labels or sound bites. Doing acts of kindness is absolutely a Jewishly religious act, and we can probably agree on quite a few things that are good, that help those in need, that benefit society as a whole, and foster a healthy environment for our planet. We may disagree on how to best implement these lofty goals and visions. We can debate, perhaps, other aspects of the modern Tikkun Olam agenda. But if we're going to disagree as Jews, let's try and connect our point of view to Jewish texts and sources. And we may still disagree, and that's also Jewish, and it's okay. Some of us will do some things we believe are a matter of Tikkun Olam, or whatever you want to call it, and others may think we're wrong-headed. But if our intentions are well-meaning, and we ground our actions in Jewish sources, then perhaps we ought to tolerate some level of disagreement. Whether we call it Tikkun Olam or Gemilut Chasadim or just being good, these high holy days are a time for us to reflect on how we can try to do more in the coming year. Shana Tova.